Deconstruction is a term that by now has entered into widespread use. I mean, I think that can be seen in the fact that it's even been in the title of a Woody Allen film, Deconstructing Harry. But while it may be increasingly rare to read through a weekend supplement without encountering the term, even if generally it's rather inappropriately used, no consensus has yet emerged within academic circles even about the significance or the importance of what the term refers to. In fact, to phrase it a little more strongly, it still occasions very passionate disagreements between those, on the one hand, who laud it as one of the most significant intellectual breakthroughs ever, and others who dismiss it as anti-scientific obscurantism. And in fact, if you Google the two words, deconstruction and obscurantism, you get over 24,000 hits. So such a long-lived disparity of judgment gives pause for reflection, especially given that deconstruction no longer counts as a very recent phenomenon. If we seek to date it and to ask when deconstruction began, to begin at the beginning, which is something that deconstruction rarely does, for reasons I'll come back to, one possible answer is 1967, the year in which Jacques Derrida published 3 books: La voix et le phénomène, translated as Speech and Phenomena; L'écriture et la différence, translated as Writing and Difference; and De la grammatologie, translated as Of Grammatology, which introduced the basic ideas and concepts for which deconstruction came to be known. I'll be coming back to those later too. And in the last of which, in Of Grammatology, he used the term deconstruction for the first time. Now, I should clarify from the outset that I won't really have time here to discuss in detail the extent to which deconstruction is separable from Derrida, right? For the purposes of this lecture, I'll be touching on it at the end, but for the purposes of this lecture, by deconstruction, I'm referring to Derrida's work. So if we provisionally accept that deconstruction began in 1967, it's now well over 40 years old. I'm sure you'd agree that 40 years is a very long time in academia. It's the span of the average academic career, and it's a very long time for an idea or an intellectual movement to remain controversial. Consider, for example, that Einstein won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921 for one of the 3 epochal papers that he had published as a total unknown just 16 years earlier in 1905. And similarly, most scientists had accepted the principle of evolution within a decade of Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species, even if it wasn't until considerably later that a consensus emerged that natural selection was the mechanism by which this occurred. Now, Derrida's ideas, too, quickly achieved a huge impact, and many would argue that they represent an intellectual revolution as far-reaching in its applications as those of Darwin and Einstein. Derrida himself certainly received many of the highest honors that academia can offer. He was elected as a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, for example, in 1985. He won many, many prizes. He was awarded a huge amount of, a very large number of honorary degrees from universities, including ones as prestigious as Cambridge and Columbia. So what's so interesting in his case is the combination of 2 things. One is the depth of the hostility that work widely recognized as of the highest intellectual caliber aroused, as can be evidenced, for example, in the Derrida affair, which was the attempt by philosophers in Cambridge and colleagues elsewhere to prevent awarding an honorary degree to him once he'd been nominated. And the other is the longevity of the hostility that his work encountered. And it seems to me that this goes far beyond the usual resistance that any new idea is likely to encounter. Let me recall Thomas Kuhn's view that a new scientific truth triumphs, not by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually give way to a new generation that grows up familiar with it. So what's interesting here is that the passing of time has not led to a consensual or integrated view of the significance of deconstruction. What has changed, on the other hand, is the distribution of the support or the dismissal across disciplines. Whereas In its early days, Derrida's work was a site of controversy pretty much everywhere across the whole academic institution. So, for example, in philosophy, which was its home discipline, because it questioned what philosophers saw as the foundations of philosophical thought. In science-based disciplines, to the degree that they were aware it existed, because its questioning of the relationship between language and reality was perceived as undermining core scientific values of objectivity and logic. And even in literature departments, even though they were, by a long talk, the most receptive to his ideas, because it questioned the assumptions underpinning many of the methodologies of reading that were most widely practiced at the time. So it seems to me that what's changed today is that in literary and in cultural studies generally, deconstruction is no longer controversial, and its principal insights have been generally accepted. That's not necessarily now the case. It's not necessarily true to say that they necessarily get practiced, translated into practice, or that there aren't many vulgarizations or misunderstandings of Derrida's work, partly because of his notoriously complicated style. But while people may not have read him, I think it's fair to say that few would wish to admit that in public. And the orthodoxy is that graduate students, for example, should have read him, should have tried him. In contrast, opinion about deconstruction remains divided elsewhere, and especially in philosophy. So, still controversial after all these years. Why? Why should deconstruction have remained so problematic? What is there about it that proves so resistant to being assigned a clear academic space? In other words, to being fully integrated within the institution. So it's time now to look in a little more detail at some of deconstruction's basic tenets or proposals. Because I'd suggest that one of the reasons for the lack of an integrated view about the significance of deconstruction relates to the fact that deconstruction is very much about questioning the integrated. Derrida is fascinated with the simple, a word whose French equivalent, simple, means both easy, or not difficult, and single, undivided. He's fascinated with showing that something that may appear simple isn't simple. One of the accusations regularly levelled against him is that his work is difficult to read and to understand. And it is. But not because it's deliberately or unnecessarily obscure, I would argue. It's rather because he's interested in showing that something that's generally considered simple is in fact complicated. And in particular, his work questions the extent to which a unit, that is, something that's generally accepted as a distinct whole, with the W, as an entity or an identity entire within its own boundaries, can safely or reliably be separated from what it seeks to keep outside those boundaries. Deconstruction shows that something is integral, an identity, for example, or a concept, because it has been differentiated as such within a system, and that its identity depends on, is made possible by, the system of which it's a part. An identity depends on its difference from other identities. So, to give a concrete example, Britishness is not something which exists on its own, which can be isolated. It only exists in relation to Irishness, or to Welshness, or to Americanness, or to Europeanness, or to Pakistaniness. There's no identity without difference. So why should this be challenging? For two main reasons. Firstly, deconstruction highlighted that difference has classically been organized as an opposition in the Western tradition, especially the Western metaphysical tradition, dating back to Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction. According to that principle, if something was true, it couldn't be false. It could be either good or bad. The inside was not the outside. Even the difference between man and woman, for example, except, of course, it's a particularly important example, because it affects everybody. Everybody operates with some explicit or implicit model of sexual difference. Even that difference was traditionally represented as a binary opposition. By definition, being a man meant not being a woman, notwithstanding the fact that there's quite a bit in common. Both have hair, both use language, both have their heart on the left side of the body, both walk upright, generally. So a partial and visible anatomical difference was overlain with all sorts of other symbolic attributions, with the result that men, for example, were associated with activity, women with passivity, men with culture, women with nature, men with the head, intellect, reason, women with the body, emotion, irrationality. And moreover, these binary opposites are generally hierarchized. Thus, for example, while man and woman are reason and irrationality, are speech and writing, are posited as independent of each other, culture has historically valorized one term of the binary more than the other. In other words, the structure which constructs difference as opposition is, in effect, a structure which represses or evacuates difference. And it's no accident that dialectical thinking has been so central to Western thought. A dialectic, where the tension between a thesis and its antithesis is resolved in a synthesis, which in turn encounters a new antithesis to be reconciled in a new synthesis, etc. That's a process of integrating mutually irreconcilable terms. But as Derrida returns to it in text after text, often a trace remains of the original difference. Something's left over that just doesn't fit perfectly, can't be properly accommodated, an excessive element that's not reducible to the synthesis. And importantly, most often that element is linguistic. No matter how clear an argument seeks to be, the very fact that an argument is made of language means that there are necessarily limits to that clarity. So to give one example, in a piece about Plato's Phaedrus, Derrida shows how Plato's use of language, whoops, there's another one. So the piece about Derrida's Plato's called La Pharmacie de Platon, Plato's Pharmacy. And in that, Derrida shows that Plato's use of language undermines his own attempt to make some rigorous distinctions, including the ones that I mentioned earlier, and including the distinction between speech and writing, not to mention the difference between philosophy and mythology. Because the Greek word pharmakon means both poison and cure or medicine, it doesn't fit into Plato's categories. Its ambiguity necessarily means that it's impossible to separate one meaning from the other. So this is an example of an aporia, a logical contradiction of some sort that represents what Derrida called the blind spot of an argument. Or to introduce another key Derridian term, it's something undecidable that exceeds the categories that are put in place to impose an order, to make a decision. So the first reason that Derrida's analysis of the differential dimension of identity aroused such controversy then is because it's an analysis of power relations. It's profoundly political. It shows that a system which ignores the difference, that is the relationship, between its constituent parts, in effect privileges some parts over others, and it signals the moments at which the limits of the system become visible, or more precisely, readable, traceable, in the form of this aporia, or of something undecidable. Deconstruction is thus an inherently political intervention insofar as it critiques a particular political status quo and points to a structural inequality. Now, as such, one might have expected deconstruction to be resisted by those who have the greatest interest in maintaining the status quo, and embraced, in contrast, by those committed to tackling inequality. Yet, interestingly, some of the most hostile responses to it have come from broadly left-leaning quarters. What this reveals is that Derrida's emphasis on a structural inequality can satisfactorily be accommodated within the left-right divide that structured political thinking since the 18th century. Most thinking about political issues, whether it's in relation to race or gender, class, sexuality, or more broadly at international level, takes its object as given. Thus, the movement to gain equal rights for women, for example, or for workers, or for gays, or for ethnic minorities, posits those identities in order to make them equal within the system. But deconstruction argues that it's impossible to eliminate structural inequalities within the system as currently constituted, and that the attempt to do so will inevitably replicate rather than transform the system. So this produced allegations that deconstruction was apolitical, which is, of course, to say, as everyone knows, conservative. It was objected, well, I think that's agreed, that's not controversial. It was objected that by not taking sides simply, and by pointing out the limits of the change that could be effected by trying to promote one element of a system, Derrida's work proposed no solution, led to no political action, and therefore could only play in favour of the status quo. Now, the question of the politics of deconstruction, and as you can imagine, it's a subject that has generated a huge amount of ink. It's very much a matter, therefore, of how to interpret Derrida's focus on the limits of the system. The hostile view was that not to take sides with one of the terms in a binary relationship is, in effect, to take sides against it. In contrast, Derrida would argue, often did argue, that taking sides in that way can at best lead to a modest change because it's based on an incomplete analysis, and that it is more, not less, revolutionary to deconstruct the opposition by teasing out and symbolizing its limits. And just for the record, we can note that Derrida in person had a very impressive record of political engagement with a wide range of very concrete practical issues at all levels, ranging from, for example, the international campaign to free Nelson Mandela to his local activism in support of the homeless in Paris. To recap then, the controversy surrounding deconstruction is in part political. It proposes an analysis of power relations, but one that corresponds to no recognizable political position, and thus it solicited criticism from across the political spectrum. Although, to my knowledge, its support has all been concentrated on the broad left. I'm not aware of any right-wing group or movement that references Derrida approvingly. So that first angle, then, is the political angle. And this one shouldn't really be opposed to it. It's displacing it, but it's a bit different. So in addition to those narrowly political implications, the very insight that the limits of the system need to be included within any discussion of the contents of the system probably itself constitutes one of the most controversial aspects of deconstruction. And it's this fundamental tenet that I want to explore in a little more detail now. Its implications for all our institutions, and in particular, that of the university or the academy, as it involves questioning the basis of the concept of reason, and therefore the very bedrock of academic activity across nearly all disciplines. Even more than its political implications, I think this is the dimension of deconstruction that got widespread press coverage, often in the mistaken belief that its questioning of the relationship between language and reality represented a relativism that excluded the possibility of objective truth and, in effect, reduced everything to kind of sophisticated wordplay. So that's what I want to explore now. Now, part of the difficulty is that deconstruction basically takes nothing as given. Ironically, given the regular accusation that Derrida espouses illogic, you could argue that, in fact, he's always assumptions and propositions that found a particular order. Thus, in addition to insisting on the relationship of difference between the different elements which constitute a system, which is what I was talking about earlier, he insists with even greater emphasis on the relationship between the system as such and its outside. In particular, he focuses on how the way something is initially framed, that is organized, established, constituted, set up, whatever, the way that has an ongoing significance, the way it continues to determine what it has produced. It's as though Derrida was compulsively drawn to asking how some question or system is determined by its outside. And again, he does this principally by focusing on those aporias that I mentioned, or those undecidable moments. And again, I think that's part of what makes reading his texts so unsettling. Because very often, in a particular text, he focuses on a detail or a moment of an argument, and he uses it then to show the conditions or assumptions which make the argument possible. Or to take a cinematic image, it's as though he zooms in on a tiny part of an argument, and that at the same time enables him to zoom out to reveal something that's greater than the whole of which the part is part. One name for that spatial, for the spatial or synchronic outside would be its context. One name for the temporal or diachronic outside would be its genesis or its origin. And this is probably the single most difficult notion in deconstruction, which is the imbrication or the non-separability, the non-extricability of structure of a particular given arrangement and genesis, what produced it. Derrida argues that to understand a structure properly, you have to consider the history that brought it into being. But equally, the genesis or the origin can't be simple. It must already have a potential for structure. It must be in parts. It must be articulated. It must already have been structured if it can initiate a process of change that will develop it into a structure. In other words, the origin is not pure. In the beginning is a difference. Now let me pause here just to stress how challenging this idea is for traditional modes of thinking. Consider the difference precisely between that formulation, in the beginning is a difference, and a famous alternative that arguably sums up the Western notion of the origin, which is the beginning of St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and in Greek the term there is logos, which is the same term. Unfortunately, it's not word. It's, I mean, unfortunately, just because it complicates things. Logos means reason or logic. Right? It's the same word that has determined logic. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. Now, what this suggests is that a thought, or a concept, or an idea, precedes the language through which it's conveyed, and therefore is separable from it. It suggests that ideas exist as such, independently of language. That meaning, not things, but meaning, exists objectively. In other words, it posits that ideas exist before they're put into words, and not that words generate ideas. It assumes a transcendental sphere, whether you call it God, or truth, or absolute knowledge. A transcendent element of some kind that stands over and guarantees meaning and serves as the arbiter of the distinction between the true and the false. And here is where the distinction between speech and writing is of relevance. The distinction between speech and writing served historically to offer an image of the difference between a good use of language and a bad one. For Plato, speech is good because the speaker is there in person to explain, assume, elaborate on what he or she is saying, right? To elucidate its meaning. Meaning, in other words, was located in the speaker's intention, not in what he or she actually said. And the reason that Plato considered writing nefarious, a pharmakon, a poison, on the other hand, was precisely because it's separated from its origin. With a piece of text, its origin isn't there. There isn't somebody there necessarily to resolve an inconsistency or an ambiguity. Only the words can be held responsible for their meaning. So deconstruction painstakingly and laboriously argues, in text after text, that Plato's distinction between good and bad language, or speech and writing, doesn't hold. That all language, spoken and written, in fact, works in the same way. Even in speech, the speaker cannot control the meaning of his or her words. Derrida proved this point particularly powerfully in a text itself called Différence, La Différence, in which he coined a new concept of difference, but difference, as you can see, spelt with an A, not with an E, although it sounds exactly the same as the usual difference spelled with an E. Now, this is very significant in French because the verb différer means both, as in English, to differ, but also to defer. In other words, it has both a spatial and a temporal application. The verb, in other words, differs from itself, harbors something different from itself within itself. And any utterance of the word necessarily brings both meanings into play, with the consequence that the meaning is constantly deferred. And even orally, especially orally, in fact, in this particular instance, unless Derrida explicitly spelled out at each instance of which meaning of the term he wanted to invoke, the reader, or the public, the people listening, couldn't decide which meaning was at stake. But what's particularly interesting, of course, is that some ambiguities can't be resolved. Deconstruction shows that language is underpinned not by a godlike origin, but by the very movement of what came to be known as différence. And this différence is probably the single hardest idea of Derrida's to grasp, precisely because it doesn't manifest itself as a presence. And here I think the limits of my earlier cinematic comparison may prove instructive. Whereas in cinema, when you zoom out, you just increase the scene. You reveal more of the scene. You bring whatever framed the preceding shot into the scene, make it visible. It integrates the previous scene with its outside, makes it all into one scene. The outside which interests Derrida can never be integrated as a presence, as an additional visible or manifest thing, entity, concept, whatever, that can become perceptible either by the intellect or by the senses, in the same way as the things or presences or identities within the system that's different from it can be. And I think this helps to explain another complicated feature of Derrida's style, which is that his texts begin repeatedly. They keep on beginning. They begin, and then they begin again, and then they begin again, and they begin again. If, as I said at the beginning, deconstruction rarely begins at the beginning or keeps multiplying the beginning, it's because the beginning for Derrida is constantly deferred. To go back to my earlier quotation, in the beginning was something that wasn't there yet. All meaning, then, is rooted in language. And that was what Derrida was getting at when he said of grammatology, and I thought I'd bring this because I think it's the most controversial thing he's ever said. There's nothing outside the text. All is textual play with no connection with original truth. Taken out of context, this could be read, and indeed was read, as suggesting that Derrida is saying language is all there is. Nothing exists outside of language. All differences amount to elaborate word play. In context, the quotation rather suggests that meaning is always a matter of signification rather than of reference. It's not, in other words, that words don't relate to reality or that the relationship to reality doesn't matter, but rather that that relationship between language and reality is always mediated via language itself. All meaning is produced by a play of difference. To move towards a conclusion then, where is deconstruction today? And, a more interesting question, where will it be tomorrow? It's no accident, I think, that it's been integrated into literary studies, where there is least resistance to the idea that meaning is a matter of words. Poets have always known that. There's a wonderful story about the painter Degas, who asked his friend Mallarmé, who's probably one of the greatest French poets ever, to comment on some poetry that he, Degas, had written. And Mallarmé apparently read it and was less than enthusiastic, at which point Degas is reported to have shaken his head in perplexity and said, funny that, I put some good ideas into it. And Mallarmé responded, but it's not with ideas you make a poem, it's with words. What makes a good poem is not what the poet wanted to say, but the way in which the words in the poem combine to create meaning. And as such, literature is arguably the one space where the play of language as theorized by deconstruction is consistently celebrated rather than repressed. Because of that, I suppose deconstruction is guaranteed at least a minimal afterlife, because its insights are of fundamental relevance in that they concern the way that language operates productively. But precisely deconstruction shows that the play of language that's maximized in literature conditions the possibility of meaning in all domains, in every linguistic practice, including those defined by the attempt to abstract or to divorce the content from the form through which it's conveyed. So the controversial question is whether deconstruction has a tomorrow in non-literary domains. My personal view on that is that deconstruction, like every other intellectual movement, will survive where it produces interesting work. One thing to make clear is that it never sought to dominate the academy. Derrida never suggested that deconstruction should be the only way of thinking, or that it offered either a universally relevant problematic, or indeed a universal methodology. On the contrary, it's about questioning the idea that there's ever the same that's applicable everywhere. It's about questioning the universal, the integrated sameness. In theory, a deconstructive approach may well be universalizable. But of course there are areas where it would be of academic interest, that is to say, it would only be of academic interest as a purely logical or intellectual possibility to focus on how a particular system or order is determined by its outside, limited by the way that it's constituted. It might be possible to identify the conditions of possibility of given structures, but it wouldn't necessarily be very interesting. It wouldn't necessarily be very fruitful. As a rule of thumb, I'd suggest that the more a discipline belongs to the hard sciences, the less likely it is that the questions that deconstruction opens up would be the most productive research questions to work with. So it'll certainly never take over the academy. But I'd say deconstruction does reach questions other modes of thinking don't reach, and not just within literature. Precisely because many disciplines within the humanities and the social sciences emulate the hard sciences, that is, posit a sameness at some level with them, there's room for deconstruction. It's relatively likely that exploring the differences that are hidden or repressed by the emulation would prove productive. So to conclude, let me suggest that infiltration may be a more relevant metaphor than domination to describe the position that deconstruction, I think, is likely to maintain towards the future. There's lots of room for deconstruction at the edges of lots of disciplines. It'll never be dominant, but my guess is that it will maintain a marginal presence and continue to exert a subversive and productive influence. Thank you very much. Sure, yeah. 35 minutes. 35 minutes.
We have time for just about one question, I believe, if anyone is inspired. Sir? Oh, if you wait 1 second, we have to bring a microphone to you so you can be heard.
Well, if you say it, I could repeat it, couldn't I?
Oh, okay, that'd be good.
I mean,
forgive my ignorance. Given the primacy of what you said about language,
yeah.
Did Lacan influence Derrida?
Given the primacy of what I said about language, did Lacan influence Derrida? Oh, they had a very, very turbulent relationship. I mean, absolutely. Derrida was definitely formed by, influenced by Lacan, But Derrida was probably the first heavyweight to challenge Lacan as well, and to argue that Lacan, at some level, did posit a transcendental outside. For him, was the phallus, right? But in a way, what Derrida argues, to some extent, is that Lacan had science envy, if you like, that Lacan did want to stop. Lacan did bring out that language functions in this kind of endless displacement, right? That precisely you can never get meaning here and now. It's constantly be deferred in a chain of signification. But it's interesting that for Lacan, there were moments where that stopped, which were, you know, moments partly in which his own authority, in which a particular kind of masculine authority, you know, he assumed that. So Derrida did show that there were these blind points in Lacan's own argument, and that he did try to stop. He resisted his own insight that language was constantly creative.
Perhaps one more round of applause as we take one.